Some nights, loneliness sits so heavy on your chest, you wonder if morning will ever come. For Ingrid, 52 and widowed 10 long winters, that feeling had become as familiar as the cold fjord winds that whistled through her small cottage. In Eldrun village, she never expected love to find her again. Her days were simple now, tending herbs, mending clothes, keeping the memories of her lost husband warm in her heart. Life had settled into a quiet rhythm that felt safe, if empty. Then a winter storm washed a giant of a man onto her shore. Halvar was everything she feared, scarred, dangerous, with hands that knew violence and eyes that held dark secrets. But when he looked at her with unexpected gentleness, when his deep voice trembled as he spoke her name, something stirred in her heart that she thought was gone forever. What happens when two wounded souls find each other in the depths of winter? Before we begin, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered window of Ingrid's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the wooden floor where she knelt grinding dried elderberries. Her fingers worked with practiced precision, crushing the dark berries. Between stone and pestle, a rhythm as familiar as her own heartbeat. The ancient healing scrolls lay spread across her work table, their parchment edges worn soft from generations of careful handling. Her grandmother's wisdom, her mother's knowledge, and now her own discoveries filled these precious documents, each remedy a thread connecting her to the women who came before. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and healing herbs, lavender, chamomile, and the sharp tang of willow bark. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters like fragrant curtains, casting dancing shadows in the firelight. This was her sanctuary, built with her own hands alongside her beloved Eric 23 years ago. Every beam, every stone in the hearth held memories of their life together. Ingrid paused in her work, her fingers unconsciously finding the simple silver band that still circled her ring finger. 10 winters had passed since Eric fell defending a merchant caravan from raiders, yet she couldn't bring herself to remove this last connection to their love. The metal had grown thin with wear, just as her hope for companionship had worn away. With the passing seasons, at 52, she had made peace with solitude. Her days followed a comforting pattern, rising before dawn to tend the herb garden, preparing remedies for the villagers who sought her help, sharing meals with neighbors who had grown to depend on her quiet wisdom. The children called her Tante Ingrid, though she had never borne children of her own. The village women brought their troubles to her kitchen table, knowing she would listen without judgment and offer counsel rooted in compassion rather than gossip. Eldren was a small settlement nestled between towering cliffs and the grey waters of the fjord. Fishing boats bobbed at the wooden pier, their masts creaking in the winter wind. The village had perhaps 60 souls in all, fishermen and their families, a blacksmith, the miller, and old Magnus, who served as both priest and keeper of the ancient stories. They lived simply, bound together by necessity and the harsh beauty of their northern homeland. The storm had been building for days, dark clouds gathering like the fist of an angry god. Ingrid had spent the afternoon securing her herb garden, covering the more delicate plants with woven mats and bringing the ceramic pots indoors. The wind howled around her cottage walls, rattling the shutters and sending sparks dancing up the chimney. She settled by the fire with her mending, listening to the waves crash against the rocky shore below. It was past midnight when she heard the sound, a deep groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first, she thought it was merely the wind finding new crevices in the stone, but then it came again, unmistakably human, filled with pain and desperation. Wrapping her wool cloak around her shoulders, Ingrid ventured into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her from her feet driving, icy rain against her face. She followed the sound toward the shore, her lantern casting wild shadows across the wet stones. There, sprawled among the seaweed and driftwood, lay a man, He was enormous, easily a head taller than Eric had been, with shoulders broad enough to block out the moon. His hair hung in wet tangles, dark as the storm clouds above. Blood seeped from a gash across his forehead, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. His clothes were torn and sodden, but she could see the fine workmanship of his leather vest and the intricate metalwork on his arm rings. This was no common sailor. Practical part of her mind urged caution. Strange men washing ashore in winter storms rarely brought good fortune. But as she knelt beside him, holding the lantern close to his face, she saw something that stopped her breath. Even unconscious, even battered by the sea, his features held a gentleness she hadn't expected. His beard was streaked with grey, speaking of a man who had lived through hardships and earned his scars. "You poor soul," she whispered, checking his pulse with fingers that knew their work. His heart beat strong and steady despite his injuries. "What brought you to my shore on such a night?" Getting him to her cottage proved a challenge that tested every muscle in her body. She managed to fashion a crude stretcher from driftwood and rope, then spent the better part of an hour dragging him up the rocky path. By the time she had him settled on the pallet near her fireplace, dawn was breaking grey and cold over the fjord. In the morning light, she could see the full extent of his injuries. The head wound would heal cleanly with proper care, but his ribs bore dark bruises, and his left arm hung at an odd angle. She set to work with the skills her mother had taught her, cleaning wounds with herbal solutions, setting the broken bone with splints of carved wood. He drifted in and out of fevered. Sleep for 3 days, sometimes muttering words in the old tongue, sometimes crying out names she didn't recognize. She spooned broth between his lips when he would take it, changed the bandages on his wounds, and kept the fire burning bright against the winter cold. The ancient scrolls guided her hands as she mixed poultices of comfrey and calendula, teas of willow bark and meadowsweet. On the 4th morning, his eyes opened clear and focused for the first time. They were blue as summer skies, startling in their intensity. He studied her face with careful attention, taking in her graying hair bound back in practical braids, the lines that life had etched around her eyes, the gentle strength in her weathered hands. "You saved me," he said, his voice rough from disuse but surprisingly gentle. The words carried the weight of deep gratitude. "The sea brought you to my shore," Ingrid replied, continuing to stir the porridge she was preparing for his breakfast. "I merely did what anyone would do for a soul in need." He struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing ribs. "Not anyone. I've known plenty who would have left a stranger to the mercy of the tides." She helped him settle, against the pillows she had arranged, noting how he tried to minimize his discomfort. "What's your name?" "Halvar," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Halvar Eriksson." The name sent a small chill through her. Eric's son, though surely not her Eric's child. It was common enough among their people to name sons for honored fathers. Still, the coincidence felt like a thread in the great tapestry of fate. "I am Ingrid," she offered in return. "This is my home, my village. You're safe here while you heal." Something flickered across his features, surprise, perhaps, or relief she hadn't expected. "Your kindness is more than I deserve." "Every soul deserves kindness," she said firmly, ladling porridge into a wooden bowl. "Especially those who've been broken by the sea." As she fed him, his injured arm making the task difficult, she found herself studying his face. The scars that marked his skin spoke of battles fought and survived. But there was something else there, a sadness that ran deeper than physical wounds, a weariness that reminded her of her own quiet grief. "What brought you to these waters?" she asked gently. "Your ship. Did others survive?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I sailed alone. My ship broke apart on the rocks during the storm. There are no others to mourn." The simple words held layers of meaning she didn't yet understand. But she recognized the tone, the careful distance of someone who had learned to guard his heart against further breaking. It was a voice she knew well, for she had used it herself in the years since Eric's death. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the village awakening, children calling to one another, the creak of cartwheels on the cobbled path, the distant ring of Magnus's hammer on his anvil. Soon, someone would come seeking remedies or counsel, and they would discover her unexpected guest. She hoped they would welcome a stranger in need, but experience had taught her that fear often spoke louder than compassion in the hearts of common folk. "Rest now," she told him, gathering the empty bowl and settling a warm blanket around his shoulders. "Your body needs time to remember its strength." But as she moved about her morning tasks, she found her thoughts returning to the man by her fire. There was something about Halvar Eriksson that stirred feelings she had thought buried with her husband. Not love, surely not love, not yet, but recognition. The acknowledgement of one wounded soul meeting another, both seeking something they had lost along the way. The silver ring on her finger caught the morning light as she worked, a reminder of promises made and kept, of a love that had sustained her through 23 years of marriage and 10 years of widowhood. But for the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she found herself wondering if her heart might have room for new promises, new possibilities. The thought both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The morning light filtered through the frost-covered window of Ingrid's cottage, casting delicate patterns across the wooden floor where she knelt grinding dried elderberries. Her fingers worked with practiced precision, crushing the dark berries between stone and pestle, a rhythm as familiar as her own heartbeat. The ancient healing scrolls lay spread across her work table, their parchment edges worn soft from generations of careful handling. Her grandmother's wisdom, her mother's knowledge, and now her own discoveries filled these precious documents, each remedy a thread connecting her to the women who came before. The cottage smelled of wood smoke and healing herbs, lavender, chamomile, and the sharp tang of willow bark. Bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters like fragrant curtains, casting dancing shadows in the firelight. This was her sanctuary, built with her own hands alongside her beloved Eric 23 years ago. Every beam, every stone in the hearth held memories of their life together. Ingrid paused in her work, her fingers unconsciously finding the simple silver band that still circled her ring finger. 10 winters had passed since Eric fell defending. A merchant caravan from raiders, yet she couldn't bring herself to remove this last connection to their love. The metal had grown thin with wear, just as her hope for companionship had worn away with the passing seasons. At 52, she had made peace with solitude. Her days followed a comforting pattern, rising before dawn to tend the herb garden, preparing remedies for the villagers who sought her help, sharing meals with neighbors who had grown to depend on her quiet wisdom. The children called her Tante Ingrid, though she had never borne children of her own. The village women brought their troubles to her kitchen table, knowing she would listen without judgment and offer counsel rooted in compassion rather than gossip. Eldrun was a small settlement nestled between towering cliffs and the grey waters of the fjord. Fishing boats bobbed at the wooden pier, their masts creaking in the winter wind. The village had perhaps 60 souls in all, fishermen and their families, a blacksmith, the miller, and old Magnus, who served as both priest and keeper of the ancient stories. They lived simply, bound together by necessity and the harsh beauty of their northern homeland. The storm had been building for days, dark clouds gathering like the fist of an angry god. Ingrid had spent the afternoon securing her herb garden, covering the more delicate plants with woven mats and bringing the ceramic pots indoors. The wind howled around her cottage walls, rattling the shutters and sending sparks dancing up the chimney. She settled by the fire with her mending, listening to the waves crash against the rocky shore below. It was past midnight when she heard the sound, a deep groan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. At first, she thought it was merely the wind finding new crevices in the stone, but then it came again, unmistakably human, filled with pain and desperation. Wrapping her wool cloak around her shoulders, Ingrid ventured into the storm. The wind nearly knocked her from her feet, driving. Icy rain against her face. She followed the sound toward the shore, her lantern casting wild shadows across the wet stones. There, sprawled among the seaweed and driftwood, lay a man. He was enormous, easily a head taller than Eric had been, with shoulders broad enough to block out the moon. His hair hung in wet tangles, dark as the storm clouds above. Blood seeped from a gash across his forehead, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. His clothes were torn and sodden, but she could see the fine workmanship of his leather vest and the intricate metalwork on his arm rings. This was no common sailor. The practical part of her mind urged caution. Strange men washing ashore in winter storms rarely brought good fortune. But as she knelt beside him, holding the lantern close to his face, she saw something that stopped her breath. Even unconscious, even battered by the sea, his features held a gentleness she hadn't expected. His beard was streaked with grey, speaking of a man who had lived through hardships and earned his scars. "You poor soul," she whispered, checking his pulse with fingers that knew their work. His heart beat strong and steady despite his injuries. "What brought you to my shore on such a night?" Getting him to her cottage proved a challenge that tested every muscle in her body. She managed to fashion a crude stretcher from driftwood and rope, then spent the better part of an hour dragging him up the rocky path. By the time she had him settled on the pallet near her fireplace, dawn was breaking grey and cold over the fjord. In the morning light, she could see the full extent of his injuries. The head wound would heal cleanly with proper care, but his ribs bore dark bruises, and his left arm hung at an odd angle. She set to work with the skills her mother had taught her, cleaning wounds with herbal solutions, setting the broken bone with splints of carved wood. He drifted in and out of fevered sleep for 3 days, sometimes muttering words in the old tongue, sometimes crying out names she didn't recognize. She spooned broth between his lips when he would take it, changed the bandages on his wounds, and kept the fire burning bright against the winter cold. The ancient scrolls guided her hands as she mixed poultices of comfrey and calendula, teas of willow bark and meadow sweet. On the 4th morning, his eyes opened clear and focused for the first time. They were blue as summer skies, startling in their intensity. He studied her face with careful attention, taking in her greying hair bound back in practical braids, the lines that life had etched around her eyes, the gentle strength in her weathered. "Hans, you saved me," he said, his voice rough from disuse but surprisingly gentle. The words carried the weight of deep gratitude. "The sea brought you to my shore," Ingrid replied, continuing to stir the porridge she was preparing for his breakfast. "I merely did what anyone would do for a soul in need." He struggled to sit up, wincing as the movement pulled at his healing ribs. "Not anyone. I've known plenty who would have left a stranger to the mercy of the tides." She helped him settle against the pillows she had arranged, noting how he tried to minimize his discomfort. "What's your name?" "Halvar," he said after a moment's hesitation. "Halvar Eriksson." The name sent a small chill through her. Eric's son, though surely not her Eric's child. It was common enough among their people to name sons for honored fathers. Still, the coincidence felt like a thread in the great tapestry of fate. "I am Ingrid," she offered in return. "This is my home, my village. You're safe here while you heal." Something flickered across his features. Surprise, perhaps, or relief she hadn't expected. "Your kindness is more than I deserve." "Every soul deserves kindness," she said firmly, ladling porridge into a wooden bowl. "Especially those who've been broken by the sea." As she fed him, his injured arm making the task difficult, she found herself studying his face. The scars that marked his skin spoke of battles fought and survived. But there was something else. There. A sadness that ran deeper than physical wounds, a weariness that reminded her of her own quiet grief. "What brought you to these waters?" she asked gently. "Your ship. Did others survive?" His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I sailed alone. My ship broke apart on the rocks during the storm. There are no others to mourn." The simple words held layers of meaning she didn't yet understand, but she recognized the tone, the careful distance of someone who had learned to guard his heart against further breaking. It was a voice she knew well, for she had used it herself in the years since Eric's death. Outside, she could hear the sounds of the village awakening, children calling to one another, the creak of cartwheels on the cobbled path, the distant ring of Magnus's hammer on his anvil. Soon, someone would come seeking remedies or counsel, and they would discover her unexpected guest. She hoped they would welcome a stranger in need, but experience had taught her that fear often spoke louder than compassion in the hearts of common folk. "Rest now," she told him, gathering the empty bowl and settling a warm blanket around his shoulders. "Your body needs time to remember its strength." But as she moved about her morning tasks, she found her thoughts returning to the man by her fire. There was something about Halvar Eriksson that stirred feelings she had thought buried with her husband. Not love, surely not love, not yet, but recognition. The acknowledgement of one wounded soul meeting another, both seeking something they had lost along the way. The silver ring on her finger caught the morning light as she worked, a reminder of promises made and kept, of a love that had sustained her through 23 years of marriage and 10 years of widowhood. But for the first time in longer than she cared to remember, she found herself wondering if her heart might have room for new promises, new possibilities. The thought both thrilled and terrified her in equal measure. The days that followed Magnus's reluctant agreement felt suspended between hope and apprehension, like the moment before dawn, when night and day balance on the edge of becoming. Ingrid found herself hyper-aware of every sound from the village, every glance cast toward her cottage, every whispered conversation that fell silent when she approached. Halvar seemed equally conscious of his precarious position. He moved through her small home with careful deliberation, as if sudden movements might shatter the fragile trust that held his fate. His left arm remained weak from the break, but he insisted on helping with whatever tasks he could manage. She would find him attempting to carry water buckets with his good arm, or struggling one-handed to stack firewood against the cottage wall. "You don't need to prove anything to me," she told him on the 5th morning after the confrontation, watching him fumble with a piece of kindling that kept slipping from his grip. "Perhaps not to you," he replied, finally managing to place the wood in the pile. "But to myself, yes, and to them." He nodded toward the village center, where she could see Astrid hanging washing on a line, her movements sharp with nervous energy. It was then that he disappeared into the small lean-to workshop attached to her cottage, emerging hours later with wood shavings in his hair and something hidden behind his broad back. When he presented it to her, she felt her breath catch. The wooden bowl sat in his palm like a prayer made manifest, simple, smooth, carved from a piece of driftwood with a grace that spoke of patient hands and careful attention. The grain of the wood flowed like water around the rim, and the base had been shaped to nestle perfectly in cupped hands. "It's beautiful," she whispered, accepting the bowl and turning it slowly to catch the light from the window. "Where did you learn to work wood like this?" A shadow of embarrassment crossed his features. "My father, before I took to raiding, before I learned that destruction came easier than creation. He tried to teach me his trade, but I was too eager for adventure, too hungry for glory." He paused, watching her fingers trace the smooth curve of the bowl. Perhaps some part of his teaching remained, waiting for quieter hands to remember it. That evening she used the bowl to serve him soup, and noticed how his eyes lingered on it with something like pride. It was a small thing, this gift of carved wood, but it felt like a bridge between the man he had been and the man he was trying to become. The village's response to his presence remained mixed. Some, like young Gunnar, crossed the street then walked past Ingrid's cottage. Others, particularly the older women, began to nod politely when they encountered him during his careful walks to build strength in his healing body. Magnus maintained a watchful neutrality, neither welcoming nor condemning, but clearly reserving judgment. It was Ragnhild, the fisherman's widow who lived 2 cottages down, who first showed something approaching acceptance. She appeared at Ingrid's, a doctor on a grey morning, her weathered hands clutching a torn fishing net. "I heard tell your guest has some skill with repairs," she said without preamble, her sharp eyes taking in Halvar where he sat by the fire, carefully flexing his healing. My poor hands shake too much these days for the fine work, and I can't afford to buy new netting." Halvar looked to Ingrid, a question in his gaze. At her encouraging nod, he rose and approached the older woman with respectful attention. "I've mended nets before," he said simply. "If you'll trust my hands with your livelihood, I'll do my best to make it whole." Ragnhild studied him for a long moment, taking in his scars, his careful posture, the genuine humility in his voice. "Aye, well, we all need our livelihoods whole, don't we? And holes in nets catch no fish, regardless of who mends them." She left the netting, and Halvar spent the afternoon working on it with meticulous care, his large fingers surprisingly deft as they wove new threads through the gaps. Ingrid watched him work, noting the peaceful concentration that settled over his features, the satisfaction he seemed to take in the methodical task of repair rather than destruction. When Ragnhild returned the next day to collect her mended net, she examined his work with the critical eye of someone whose survival depended on the quality of her tools. "Good work," she pronounced finally. "Better than good. You've a fine hand for this kind of task." She paused, seeming to wrestle with something internal. "If you've a mind for more such work, there are others in the village who could use help. With their nets, I could speak to them if you're willing." The offer hung in the air like an extended hand. Ingrid held her breath, knowing this was the first real step toward acceptance from the community. "I would be grateful for the work," Halvar said carefully, "and grateful for your advocacy with your neighbors." Ragnhild nodded sharply. "Mind you don't make me regret speaking for you." "I won't," he promised, and something in his voice made Ingrid believe it completely. That evening, as they shared the simple meal she had prepared, Ingrid found herself studying Halvar's profile in the firelight. The harsh angles that had first spoken of violence seemed softer now, marked instead by concentration and purpose. His hands, the same hands that had once wielded weapons in raids, now bore small cuts from honest work, stained with the natural dyes used in net repair. "You seem different," she observed, refilling his bowl with stew. He considered this, chewing slowly. "I feel different. Strange as it may sound, these past days have been some of the most peaceful of my adult life." Even with the village's suspicion, especially with it, he met her eyes across the small table. "When men fear you only for your capacity for violence, when they respect you only for your skill in battle, you begin to forget there are other ways to earn regard. Other ways to be useful to your fellow creatures." Ingrid felt something warm unfurl in her chest at his words. This was not the practiced charm of a man seeking to manipulate, but the honest reflection of someone genuinely surprised by his own capacity for change. "Ragnhild was right," she said. "You do have a fine hand for repair work. There's something to be said for mending what's broken instead of breaking what's whole." "Is that what I'm doing here?" he asked quietly. "Mending something broken?" The question carried layers of meaning. Was he referring to the nets, to his own reputation, to something deeper that had been damaged in both their lives? She found she didn't have a simple answer. "Perhaps we both are," she replied finally, her fingers unconsciously finding the silver ring she still wore. "Sometimes the broken things are the ones most worth fixing." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending sparks dancing up the chimney. But inside the cottage, surrounded by the smell of wood smoke and healing herbs, warmed by honest work and careful conversation, Ingrid felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the sensation of possibility, of a life that might hold more than mere survival. Beside her, Halvar carefully cleaned his hands with a cloth, removing the last traces of his day's labor. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic, as if he were washing away not just the physical remnants of work, but some invisible stain from his past. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove himself worthy of the fragile trust he had been granted. But tonight, for the first time since the storm brought him to her shore, both of them seemed to believe that tomorrow was worth working toward. The breakthrough came on a night when the aurora painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, dancing above the fjord like the breath of ancient gods. Ingrid had stepped outside to gather more firewood, leaving Halvar warming himself by the hearth, when she noticed him touching something at his throat, a small pendant she hadn't seen before, half hidden beneath his tunic. "I didn't know you wore jewelry," she said when she returned, setting the wood beside the fire. His hand moved instinctively to cover the pendant, then stopped. After a moment's hesitation, he drew it out, a small rune stone carved from bone, suspended on a leather cord worn soft with age. "It was my mother's," he said quietly, "the only thing of hers I still carry." The firelight caught the intricate carvings, symbols that spoke of protection, of safe journeys, of a mother's love following her son wherever he might wander. Ingrid could see the care with which it had been crafted, each line deliberate and meaningful. "She gave it to you when you left home?" "When I was 15 and burning to prove myself a man. She pressed it into my hands the morning I sailed with my first raiding party." His voice carried the weight of old pain. "She said it would keep me safe. But more than that, it would remind me who I was beneath whatever I became." Ingrid settled in the chair across from him, sensing the importance of this moment. Did it work? He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "For a time, I thought not. I became exactly what I swore I'd never be. A killer without conscience, a man who took pleasure in others' fear." The pendant felt like a burning coal against my chest, reminding me of promises broken, of the mother who would weep to see what her gentle boy had grown into. "But you wore it anyway, even when I hated what it represented, even when I wanted to cast it into the sea and be done with the past entirely." He turned the small stone over in his palm. "Strange how the things we try hardest to forget are often the things that save us in the end." "What changed?" she asked gently. "What made you remember who you were beneath what you'd become?" His eyes grew distant, fixed on something she couldn't see. "A raid. 3 seasons passed, against a settlement much like this one. We came at dawn, when the men were out with their boats, expecting easy pickings from the women and children left behind." Ingrid felt her chest tighten, recognizing the familiar pattern of violence that had taken Eric from her. "But they fought." "Back," Halvar continued. "Not with swords or axes, they had few enough of those, but with desperate courage. A woman not much younger than you threw herself between her children and my sword. She didn't beg for mercy. She simply stood there, arms spread wide, and said, 'You'll have to kill me first.'" "Did you?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Halvar's hand closed around the pendant, his knuckles white with the force of his grip. "I raised my blade," he said finally. Felt the familiar weight of it, the balance that had become second nature after so many years of killing. And then he paused, struggling with memory. "Then I looked into her eyes and saw my own mother looking back at me, saw the woman who had carved this pendant with her own hands, who had sent her son into the world with prayers for his safety and his soul." "What did you do?" "I lowered my sword, told her to gather her children and run. My clan brothers thought I'd lost my mind. Perhaps I had. They called me weak, coward, worse things than that. But I couldn't raise my blade against her, couldn't bear to create another. Motherless child, another widow like—" He stopped abruptly, his eyes finding hers across the firelight. "Like me," Ingrid finished softly. "Like you. Though I didn't know your story then, I could feel the weight of all the women I'd helped make widows, all the children I'd left fatherless." The pendant felt different that day, not a burning reminder of shame, but a cool touch of forgiveness. As if my mother was telling me it wasn't too late to choose differently. The silence that followed was comfortable rather than awkward, filled with the crackle of burning wood and the distant sound of waves against stone. Ingrid found herself thinking of Eric, of the morning he'd kissed her goodbye for the last time, never knowing it would be the last. She thought of all the mornings since then, waking to empty space beside her, learning to carry her grief like a familiar weight. The clan cast you out for refusing to kill her, not immediately, but my refusal to participate in the worst of our raids, my protection of innocence when I could manage it, it marked me as unreliable, dangerous to their reputation. When I finally spoke against a planned attack on a village known to harbor only children and elderly folk, their patience ended. Exile was kinder than what they might have chosen. Do you regret it? The choice that cost you your place among them? Halvar looked at her with something like surprise. Regret saving innocence. Regret choosing mercy over murder. Never. I regret only that it took me so long to remember the man my mother raised me to be. Ingrid rose from her chair and moved to sit beside him on the bench, close enough to see the fine lines around his eyes, the silver threads in his beard that spoke of wisdom earned through suffering. She would be proud of you, the woman who carved that pendant. She would see that her gentle boy found his way home at last. Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability she hadn't seen before. Do you think so? Even after all the darkness, all the lives I took before I learned better? I think mothers understand something about redemption that the rest of us struggle to learn, she said, her voice gentle but certain. I think she knew that the man who could be moved by mercy was still alive inside the warrior, waiting for the right moment to emerge. He was quiet for a long moment, then reached up to touch her hand where it rested on her knee. His fingers were warm, calloused from honest work, and she didn't pull away from the contact. How is it that you understand so much about forgiveness? He asked. You, who lost your husband to men like I used to be? The question touched something deep in her heart, a place where anger and grief had slowly transformed into something more, complex, because holding on to hatred was killing me as surely as any sword, because Eric wouldn't have wanted me to spend my life consumed by bitterness, and because, she paused, surprised by her own honesty, because some people are worth the risk of believing they can change. His hand tightened slightly over hers, and she felt something pass between them. Not quite love, not yet, but recognition. The acknowledgement of two people who had survived their own forms of devastation and found themselves capable of hope once more. Outside, the aurora continued its ancient dance, painting the world in colors that had no earthly names. Blessing. The night with beauty that asked nothing of mortal hearts except the willingness to witness wonder. Winter deepened around Eldren like a slow embrace, bringing longer nights and shorter days, filled with the kind of intimacy that only shared solitude can create. Ingrid's cottage had become a world unto itself, warmed not just by the fire, but by the quiet rhythm she and Halvar had settled into. He tending to repairs and small tasks while she worked at her loom, the ancient wooden frame her grandmother had built, singing softly as the shuttle passed back and forth. The loom dominated one corner of the main room, its sturdy oak construction polished smooth by generations of women's hands. Ingrid had been weaving wool into warm cloth since she could reach the heddles, and the meditative repetition of the work had carried her through her darkest days after Eric's death. Now she found herself weaving something different, a cloak of deep blue wool shot through with threads of silver, worked with a care that surprised her. "It's beautiful," Halvar said one evening, looking up from the fishing net he was mending, to watch her hands guide the shuttle. "The pattern, it reminds me of moonlight on water. It's for you," she said simply, then felt heat rise in her cheeks at the admission. "Your cloak was ruined by the sea. You'll need something warm for—" She stopped, not wanting to finish the thought. "For when you leave." But Halvar understood. He set down his needle and came to stand beside her, his fingers trailing over the partially completed fabric with reverence. "You're weaving this for me." The wonder in his voice made her heart skip strangely. "I couldn't let you face another winter in torn cloth," she said, trying to keep her tone practical. Besides, it gives my hands something to do during the long evenings." "No," he said quietly. "It's more than that, isn't it? This isn't just charity for a stranger." She couldn't deny it. Not when he stood so close she could smell the wood smoke in his hair, could see the way the firelight caught the blue of his eyes. Somewhere in the weeks of shared meals and quiet conversations, of watching him transform from wounded warrior to gentle man, he had stopped being a stranger. He had become something far more dangerous to her carefully ordered life. Perhaps not, she admitted. The moment stretched between them, filled with possibility and the weight of unspoken feelings. Then the sound of voices outside broke the spell, and they stepped apart as footsteps approached the cottage. Magnus appeared at the door, accompanied by Björn and two men Ingrid didn't immediately recognize, traders by their dress, with the weather-beaten faces of those who traveled the harsh northern roads. "Ingrid," Magnus said without preamble, "these men bring news from the southern settlements, news that affects us all." She gestured them inside, noting how Halvar had positioned himself near the wall where shadows would partially conceal his distinctive height and build. The trader's eyes swept the room, taking in the domestic scene, the half-finished weaving, the mended net stacked neatly in the corner. "There's been trouble along the coast roads," the older trader said, accepting the cup of ale Ingrid offered. "Raids by the Iron Wolves clan. They've grown bolder this season, hitting settlements that used to be safe from their attention." Ingrid felt Halvar go rigid beside her, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "How far south?" Magnus asked grimly. 3 days' journey, maybe 4 if the weather holds bad. The trader drained his cup and wiped his beard. "They're moving in a pattern, working their way along the fjords. Some say they're looking for something or someone." The implications hung heavy in the air. Björn's eyes found Halvar, and Ingrid could see the suspicion rekindling in the blacksmith's gaze. "Any word on what they might be seeking?" Magnus asked carefully. The younger trader spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the excitement of one with dramatic news to share. "They say the clan leader Thoric Bloodaxe is offering a substantial reward for information about one of their own, a traitor who fled their company. Large man, scarred from battle, goes by the name Halvar Eriksson," Halvar said quietly, stepping out of the shadows to face them directly. The traders started, hands moving instinctively toward the knives at their belts. But Halvar made no threatening moves, simply stood with the weary dignity of a man who had been expecting this moment. "You're him," the older trader breathed, "the one they're hunting." "I am. There's gold on your head," the younger man said, his eyes gleaming with possibilities. "Enough gold to buy a farm or a ship or—" "Enough," Magnus said sharply. "Whatever. A bounty may be offered. This man is under our protection. He's earned honest work among us, and we don't sell our neighbors to killers." Ingrid felt a surge of gratitude toward the elder, even as fear coiled in her stomach. If the Iron Wolves were actively searching for Halvar, it was only a matter of time before their path led to Eldren. "He's brought danger to your village," the older trader said. "Is one man's life worth risking an entire settlement?" "That's not for you to judge," Ingrid said, surprised by the steel in her own voice. "We make our own choices here about who deserves sanctuary." Halvar looked at her with something like amazement, then turned back to the traders. "How close are they? How much time do we have?" "A week, maybe less if they push hard. They're questioning everyone, merchants, fishermen, anyone who might have seen a lone warrior traveling the coast roads." "Then I have to leave," Halvar said, simply. "Tonight, before they can trace my path here." "No." The word came from Ingrid with startling force. "Running won't solve anything. They'll keep hunting, keep threatening innocent people until they find you. And winter storms. You wouldn't survive 3 days alone on the roads. Better I die in the wilderness than bring the Iron Wolves down on Eldren," he replied. "I won't be responsible for another village burned, more innocents killed." "And what if there's another way?" Magnus said thoughtfully. "What if instead of running, we prepare to face them?" Björn snorted. "Old man, have you lost your mind? We're fishermen and farmers, not warriors. What chance would we have against seasoned raiders?" "Perhaps more than you think," Magnus said, his gaze fixed on Halvar. "We have something they don't expect. Someone who knows their methods, their weaknesses, someone who's fought beside them and learned their ways." The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge. Ingrid could see the conflict in Halvar's face, the instinct to protect warring with the reluctance to take up arms again, even in defense of innocent lives. "You're asking me to become a warrior again," he said quietly. "To plan for killing instead of creating." "I'm asking you to become a protector," Magnus corrected. "There's a difference, and I think you know it." Ingrid moved to Halvar's side, her hand finding his arm. "Whatever you choose, you don't face it alone. This village has accepted you as one of our own. We stand together." He looked down at her, reading the determination in her eyes, then at the faces around them, Magnus with his weathered wisdom, even Björn with grudging respect, the traders watching with fascination. These people, who had every reason to fear him, were offering to fight beside him against his former clan brothers. "If we do this," he said slowly, "if we make our stand here, some will die. Perhaps many. Are you prepared for that cost?" "Some will die if we do nothing as well," Magnus replied. "At least this way, we choose how we meet our fate." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending snow swirling past the windows. Inside, by the light of fire and oil lamp, the threads of a different kind of weaving were being drawn together. Bonds of loyalty and love, courage and desperation, all tangled into a pattern none of them could see clearly, but all were committed to completing. The days that followed carried an urgency that transformed the very air of Eldrun. What had been a sleepy fishing village preparing for winter's deepest. Months now buzzed with the controlled activity of people preparing for war. Magnus called meetings in the great hall, while Björn worked his forge late into the night, shaping farming tools into weapons and mending what armor could be found. Ingrid found herself at the center of it all, not as a warrior, but as something perhaps more vital, the keeper of hope. The village women came to her cottage, not just for healing herbs, but for the quiet strength she radiated, the sense that whatever came, they would face it together. Her loom had become a gathering place, where plans were woven along with wool, where fears were shared in whispered conversations over the steady rhythm of the shuttle. It was during one such gathering, 3 days after the traders brought their grim news, that everything changed between her and Halvar in a way that could not be taken back. The women had left as evening fell, carrying with them bundles of healing supplies and the kind of resolve that comes from having no choice but to be brave. Halvar emerged from the workshop where he had been crafting arrows, a skill from his youth that had returned to his hands with disturbing ease. "You're troubled," Ingrid observed, noting the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers worried. At the rune stone pendant beneath his shirt, "I've been thinking about what Magnus said, about the difference between being a warrior and being a protector." He moved to the window, staring out at the village where lamplight flickered in cottage. Windows like scattered stars. "The men who are coming, I know them. I've fought beside them, shared meals with them, called them brothers. How do I raise a weapon against men who once saved my life?" Ingrid set down her weaving and went to stand beside him. "The same way. You learned to spare the woman and her children by choosing who you are now over who you used to be." "It's not that simple," he said, his voice heavy with old pain. "When the battle comes, when blood runs hot and death stalks close, in those moments a man becomes what he truly is, not what he wishes to be. What if what I truly am is still the killer I swore I'd left behind?" She turned to face him fully, reading the genuine fear in his eyes. Not fear of dying, but fear of becoming something he could no longer live with. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" He shook his head, not trusting his voice. "I see a man who carves bowls instead of breaking them, who mends nets instead of cutting them, who builds up instead of tearing down." She reached up to touch the side of his face, feeling the roughness of his beard beneath her palm. "I see a man worth loving, even if he can't see it himself." The words hung between them like a bridge neither had quite intended to build, but both found themselves willing to cross. His hand came up to cover hers, where it rested against his cheek, and she could feel the tremor in his fingers. "Ingrid," he said, her name a prayer on his lips. "I have nothing to offer you but trouble. No home, no clan, no certainty of seeing another spring. How can you speak of love to a man with no future?" "Because the present is all any of us truly have," she replied. "Because in all my years of marriage, all my years of widowhood, I never felt about any man the way I feel about you. Because love isn't about certainty. It's about choosing each other despite the uncertainty." He pulled her closer then, his arms encircling her with a gentleness that belied his size and strength. She could feel his heart beating against her chest, could smell the wood smoke and wool that clung to his clothes, could sense the decades of loneliness in both their lives beginning to ease. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of a man who had never spoken them lightly. "I love your kindness, your strength, the way you see possibility where others see only risk. I love the woman who would stake her reputation on a stranger's redemption. And I love you," she whispered against his chest. "The man you are now, the man you're becoming, even the parts of your past that brought you to my shore." When he kissed her, it was with the reverence of a man who had been granted an unexpected miracle. There was nothing hurried or desperate in the touch of his lips against hers, only the deep recognition of two souls who had found their match in an impossible world. They made love that night with the tender intensity of people who understood that happiness, when it comes late in life, must be treasured completely. There was grey in her hair and silver in his beard, scars on both their bodies that spoke of losses and struggles survived. But in the firelight of her cottage, wrapped in the warmth of genuine affection, they found a beauty that had nothing to do with youth and everything to do with the hard-won wisdom of mature hearts. Afterward, as they lay tangled together beneath the blue cloak she had been weaving for him, Halvar traced patterns on her bare shoulder with gentle fingers. "Whatever happens when they come," he said quietly, "I want you to know that these weeks in your cottage, in your arms, they've been the closest thing to home I've known since I was a boy. This is your home now," she replied firmly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the weight of approaching danger like a storm front moving across the fjord. Outside, the wind carried the taste of snow and the distant howl of wolves, or perhaps something worse than wolves, something that walked on two legs and carried the scent of old violence. The ancestral sword that Halvar had recovered from his shipwreck lay wrapped in oiled cloth beneath her bed, its presence a reminder that the peace they had built together was fragile as spring ice. Soon, very soon, he would have to take up that blade again, to choose between the violence he had renounced and the protection of everything he had come to love. For now, though, there was only the warmth of her body against his, the steady rhythm of her breathing, the miracle of finding love when both had thought themselves too old, too wounded, too set in solitary ways for such transformation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, its own choices between honor and survival. Tonight belonged to them alone, a stolen moment of happiness in a world that offered few such gifts to those wise enough to recognize their worth. The letter arrived with the dawn, carried by a raven whose black wings cut through the grey morning sky like an omen of sorrow. Ingrid found it tied to the bird's leg as it perched on her windowsill. The parchment sealed with wax that bore the mark of the iron wolves, a snarling wolf's head surrounded by crossed axes. Halvar was still sleeping, exhausted by the previous night's preparations for the clan's expected arrival. The entire village had worked until well past midnight, sharpening weapons, reinforcing the palisade, preparing for a siege that might come with the next tide. Now, in the quiet hour before full dawn, Ingrid held the letter with trembling fingers, knowing instinctively that whatever words lay within would change everything. The message was brief, written in the angular runes of the old tongue, but its impact struck her like a physical blow. Halvar the Oathbreaker, we know where you shelter. We know the woman who harbors you. Ask her about her husband Erik Grimson and how he died on the Bjornstad road 10 winters past. Ask her if she still wants to protect the man whose sword sent her love to the halls of the dead. We come with the morning tide. The parchment slipped from her nerveless fingers, drifting to the floor like a leaf from a dying tree. Erik Grimson, her Erik, her beloved husband whose laughter had filled their cottage, whose gentle hands had helped her tend the garden, whose last kiss she still remembered with perfect clarity. The traders had said he died, defending a caravan from raiders, that he had fought bravely and fallen with honor. They had never mentioned names, never spoken of which clan had been responsible for the attack. But now, she knew, the Iron Wolves, Halvar's former clan brothers, and if the letter spoke truth, if Halvar himself had been there, had raised his sword against her husband, Ingrid? Halvar's voice came from behind her, thick with sleep. What troubles you so early? You're pale as winter moonlight. She turned to face him, seeing him clearly for the first time since the night she had pulled him from the storm-tossed shore. The scars on his arms, which she had traced with loving fingers, suddenly seemed to tell different stories. The careful way he moved, the instinctive grace of a trained killer. How had she not seen it before? How had she let herself believe that love could wash away the blood on a warrior's hands? Tell me about the Bjornstad road, she said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. Tell me about a caravan attack, 10 winters past. The color drained from Halvar's face as if she had struck him. He glanced down, seeing the letter on the floor, and understanding dawned in his eyes like the break of a terrible day. Ingrid, he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. Don't lie to me. Not now. Not about this. She picked up the letter, holding it between them like a shield. Was it true? Were you there when my husband died? The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 10 years' grief and 3 months' growing love. When Halvar finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. Yes, I was there. The admission hit her like a hammer blow, driving. The breath from her lungs. She had known somehow from the moment she read the letter, but hearing him confirm it made the betrayal complete. Did you? She couldn't finish the question, couldn't force the words past her lips. Did I kill him? Halvar completed, his eyes never leaving her face. No, but I might as well have. What does that mean? The words came out harsh, demanding. Halvar sank into a chair, suddenly looking older than his years. It means I was part of the war band that attacked the caravan. It means I stood by while my clan brothers cut down good men for the sake of a few chests of silver. It means I watched your husband die and did nothing to prevent it. Nothing. The word cracked like a whip. He fought like a hero, Ingrid. Erik Grimson fought like 3 men, protecting women and children he'd never met, merchants who meant nothing to him except that they needed defending. When Thorak Bloodaxe himself came for him, your husband didn't retreat, didn't beg for mercy. He stood his ground until the end. And you watched. I watched. God help me. I watched and did nothing because I was still the coward I'd always been. Still following orders instead of following my conscience. It wasn't until 2 seasons later that I found the courage to stand against such slaughter. Ingrid felt the world tilt around her, as if the very foundations of her cottage were shifting beneath her feet. The man she had nursed back to health, the man she had grown to love, the man she had given her body to just hours before. He had been there when Erik died, had done nothing to save the only man she had ever thought she could love, until now. Why? Didn't you tell me? She asked, her voice breaking despite her efforts to keep it steady. When you learned my name, when you realized who I was, why didn't you tell me the truth? Because I'm a coward, he said simply. Because I was selfish enough to want these weeks with you, even knowing I didn't deserve them. Because I hoped, foolishly, that Perhaps the past could stay buried, that what we had built together could be stronger than what came before. She laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitter understanding. You hoped I would never have to choose between loving you and honoring his memory. Yes, the honesty in his voice only made the pain sharper. This wasn't the calculated deception of a manipulative man, but the desperate gamble of someone who had found unexpected happiness and couldn't bear to let it go. In another time, another life, she might even have understood it, but not now. Not with Eric's ghost standing between them, his blood on Halvar's hands, even if he hadn't been the one to spill it. You have to leave, she said, surprised by how calm she sounded. Now, before the village wakes, before anyone else has to know what you are. Ingrid, no. She stepped back as he rose from his chair, putting distance between them. Don't make this harder than it already is. Don't make me choose between my love for him and my... She stopped, unable to say the word love in connection with him anymore. Your... And what? He asked quietly. What am I to you now, Ingrid? The question hung in the air like a sword suspended above both their heads. What was he now that she knew the truth? The man who had carved her a wooden bowl, the gentle soul who mended fishing nets, the lover whose touch had made her feel young again. Or was he simply another killer, no different from the raiders who had taken Eric from her? I don't know, she whispered, and the admission cost her everything. I don't know what you are anymore. Halvar nodded as if he had expected no other answer. Then I'll make the choice for both of us. I'll go as you ask. But know this, Ingrid, whatever I was 10 years ago, whatever cowardice I showed then, I would die before I let anyone harm you now. That may mean nothing to you anymore, but it's the only truth I have left to offer. He moved toward the chest where his few possessions were stored, but she caught his arm before he could take another step. The iron wolves are coming with the morning tide, she said. They know you're here. If you leave now, they'll follow your trail. The village will still be in danger. Then what would you have me do? Stay and fight beside men who trusted me? Defend a community that took me in, knowing that my presence here has painted targets on all their backs? The impossible choice stretched between them, duty to the village that had accepted him, love for the woman who could no longer bear to look at him, and the approaching threat of his former clan brothers who would show no mercy to anyone who had sheltered their exile. Outside, the first full light of dawn was breaking over the fjord, painting the sky in shades of red that looked disturbingly like blood. Soon the village would wake to discover the truth that had been sleeping in their midst. Soon choices would have to be made that would determine who lived and who died, who could forgive and who could not. And through it all, the ancestral sword beneath her bed waited in its oiled wrappings, ready to taste blood once more in the hands of a man who had hoped never to wield it again. The morning light revealed a village transformed by the weight of terrible knowledge. Magnus had called an emergency gathering in the great hall before the sun was fully risen, and now the people of Eldren sat in stunned silence as Ingrid finished reading the Iron Wolf's message aloud. The parchment shook in her hands, but her voice remained steady, the same voice that had comforted the sick, counseled the troubled, and held their small community together through countless storms. Halvar stood apart from the others, his back against the stone wall like a man facing his own execution. The battle-worn shield he had recovered from his shipwreck rested against the wall beside him, its scarred surface telling stories of conflicts survived and violence embraced. Now it would serve not as a symbol of conquest, but as protection, and for the innocent if they would still accept his defense. So it's true then, said Björn, his voice heavy with betrayal. You were there when Eric died. You saw him fall and did nothing. Yes, Halvar replied simply. There was no defiance in his voice, no attempt to justify or explain, just the flat acceptance of a man who had run out of ways to hide from his past. Young Gunnar stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. My uncle wasn't the only good man to die on that road. 3 others from the northern settlements fell that day, men with families, with children, who still ask why their fathers never came home. I know, Halvar said quietly. I remember all their faces. Do you? Gunnar's voice cracked with emotion. Do you remember how they died? Do you remember their last words, their final breaths? Or were they just obstacles to be cleared from your path to glory? The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Ingrid watched Halvar's face, seeing the way each word found its mark, each detail driving deeper into wounds that had never properly healed. They were brave men, Halvar said finally, braver than I was. They died protecting others while I stood frozen by my own cowardice. If I could trade my life for theirs, I would do it gladly. Pretty words, spat Astrid, but words don't bring back the dead. No, Magnus said slowly, his old eyes studying Halvar with the careful attention of a man trying to solve a complex puzzle. But neither does vengeance. The question before us isn't whether this man carries the stain of old sins. Clearly he does. The question is what we do with that knowledge now that we have it. Ragnhild, the fisherman's widow who had been the first to offer Halvar work, spoke into the tense silence. He mended my nets with his own hands, fed my family when the winter grew harsh. When young Kari fell through the ice last month, he was the first to dive in after her, never mind his own safety. That doesn't erase what he's done, Björn argued. No, Ragnhild agreed, but it shows what he's become. And isn't that what matters for the choice we face today? The debate continued, voices rising and falling like waves against stone. Some called for Halvar's immediate exile, unwilling to risk the village for a man whose presence had brought death to their door. Others, led by Magnus's careful reasoning, argued that abandoning him now would only ensure the Iron Wolf's wrath fell on innocents who had no part in ancient grudges. Through it all, Ingrid remained silent, her heart torn between the love that had bloomed in the quiet intimacy of shared winter evenings and the loyalty she owed to Eric's memory. She could feel the weight of the silver ring on her finger, could almost hear her husband's voice in the wind that rattled the great hall's windows. What would he have wanted? What would the man who had died protecting strangers have said about forgiveness and second chances? As the sun climbed higher, bringing with it the certainty that the Iron Wolves were drawing closer with each passing hour, the arguments began to shift from questions of justice to matters of survival. Whatever Halvar's past sins, the immediate threat was real and pressing. The clan warriors who approached their shores would show no mercy to a village that had harbored their exile, regardless of whether that harbor had been willing or not. We need to prepare, Magnus announced finally, cutting through the circular debate with the authority of his years. Whatever judgment we pass on this man's past, our immediate concern must be protecting our families, our homes, our future. The Iron Wolves come with the tide, and we must be ready. The practical preparations that followed carried an undercurrent of grim determination. Men who had never held weapons more dangerous than fishing knives tested the weight of hastily forged swords. Women gathered the children into the most defensible buildings, while the elderly prepared what supplies could be quickly moved or hidden. The blacksmith's forge rang with urgent hammering, as farm tools were transformed into instruments of war. Halvar threw himself into the preparations with the desperate energy of a man trying to atone through action. His knowledge of Iron Wolves' tactics proved invaluable. He knew their preferred methods of attack, their weaknesses, the way they would attempt to breach the village's defenses. But even as the villagers followed his strategic advice, many couldn't meet his eyes, couldn't forget the revelation that cast his presence among them in an entirely different light. As afternoon wore into evening, Ingrid found herself standing, watch on the village walls, scanning the fjord for the dark shapes of enemy ships. The battle-worn shield Halvar had claimed from his wreckage leaned against the wooden palisade beside her, its bronze boss gleaming in the fading light. Tomorrow, perhaps even tonight, it would taste battle once again. You should be in the safe. House with the other women. Halvar's voice came from behind her, quiet but concerned. She didn't turn around. This is my village too, my choice to make about where I stand when danger comes. He moved to stand beside her, careful to keep distance between them, respecting the chasm that had opened with the morning's revelations. Ingrid, I want you to know, whatever happens in the coming fight, whatever becomes of me, these months in your cottage, in your heart, they've been worth any price I might pay. Don't, she said quietly. Don't make this about us. Not now. Then what should it be? About justice, revenge, the blood debt owed for old sins. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the play of light on water, remembering other evenings when she had stood on these same walls with Eric beside her, both of them young and certain that love could conquer any obstacle the world might place in their path. It should be about choosing who we are, she said finally. Not who we were, not who others expect us to be, but who we choose to become in the face of impossible decisions. And who do you choose to be, Ingrid? The question hit her like a physical blow, forcing her to confront the truth she had been avoiding all day. Who was she? The loyal widow who honored her husband's memory above all else. The woman who had found unexpected love in her middle years. The healer who believed in redemption and second chances, or something more complex, more human than any single identity could contain? I don't know yet, she admitted, but I know that running from the choice won't make it go away. Before Halvar could respond, a shout came from the harbor watch. Dark shapes were moving on the water, 3 ships, their black sails marked with the wolf's head sigil of the clan. The iron wolves had arrived with the evening tide, just as their message had promised. Within minutes, the village had transformed into a hive of controlled activity. Final preparations were made, weapons distributed, last messages passed between husbands and wives, parents and children. The sacred fire bowl that served as the heart of their community was lit and placed in the center of the great hall, its flames dancing like prayers made visible. Halvar took up his ancestral sword for the first time since his exile, the familiar weight settling into his hand like a remembered song. The blade gleamed with oils and prayers, its edge sharp enough to split hairs, its balance perfect for the work it was designed to do. But as he looked at his reflection in the polished steel, he saw not the warrior he had been, but the protector he was trying to become. The Iron Wolves' ships drew closer to shore, their war drums beating a rhythm that spoke of death and destruction. Soon, very soon, the peaceful village of Eldren would become a battlefield where past and present love and loyalty, forgiveness and justice would clash like opposing armies. And somewhere in the midst of that chaos, Ingrid would have to choose not only who she was, but who she wanted to become. The Iron Wolves came with the darkness, their war cries splitting the night like thunder across the fjord. Torches blazed from their ship prows as they drove their vessels onto the rocky beach, warriors leaping into the surf with weapons already drawn. The sound of their approach, boots on stone, metal against metal, the harsh laughter of men who lived for violence, sent children crying for their mothers, and hardened fishermen reaching for weapons they barely knew how to hold. From her position on the village walls, Ingrid watched the enemy pour onto the shore like a dark tide. 30 warriors, maybe more, their mail shirts gleaming in the torchlight, their faces painted with the blue woad that marked them as belonging to Thorak Bloodaxe's inner circle. These were not the half-drunk raiders who occasionally threatened isolated farmsteads. These were professional killers, men who had turned warfare into an art form. Remember, Halvar's voice carried along the defensive line, calm despite the approaching storm. They'll try to break through at the weakest point in our defenses. Don't let them divide us. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and his. Words were cut off as a flight of arrows whistled over the palisade, iron points seeking flesh in the darkness. The villagers ducked instinctively, but the shafts passed overhead, a warning rather than a genuine attack. Halvar the Oathbreaker, The voice that boomed across the battlefield was harsh as grinding stone, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. Thorak Bloodaxe himself stood at the front of his warriors, a giant even among the iron wolves, his famous weapon gleaming red in the torchlight. "Come out and face judgment like a man, or do you hide behind farmers and fishermen like the coward you've become?" The taunt was designed to provoke, to make Halvar abandon the defensive advantage and meet his former leader in single combat. It was a tactic as old as warfare itself, and one that had worked countless times against men whose pride outweighed their wisdom. But Halvar had learned bitter lessons about the cost of such pride. "I stand with these people, Thorak," he called. "Back. If you want me, you'll have to come through them." "So be it." Thorak's laughter was like the howl of winter wind. "We'll burn this village to ash and pick your bones from the ruins." The first assault came from 3 directions at once, a coordinated attack that spoke of careful planning and bitter experience. Warriors with axes and swords charged the main gate, while others used grappling hooks to scale the palisade walls. A third group attempted to force entry through the harbor, wading through the shallow water where fishing boats bobbed like toys in a giant's bathtub. The sacred firebowl in the great hall seemed to burn brighter as the battle was joined, its flames leaping higher as if fed by the courage of the defenders. Magnus had insisted it be kept burning no matter what, a symbol of hope, a promise that the heart of Eldrun would survive even if its people did not. Ingrid found herself thrust into the chaos, not as a warrior, but as something equally vital, a healer moving through the darkness with her leather pouch of medicinal herbs, tending wounds as quickly as they appeared. A fishing net thrown over attacking raiders here, a bandage applied to a defender's cut there, always moving, always needed, always terrified but never stopping. She saw young Gunnar take a sword, cut across his shoulder, and bind it with torn cloth before returning to the fight. She watched Björn's hammer crush the skull of an iron wolf who had made it over the wall, the blacksmith's face grim with the knowledge that he was killing rather than creating. She witnessed Ragnhild herself wielding a boat hook like a spear, driving back raiders who threatened the harbor defenses, but it was Halvar who dominated the battle, his ancestral sword singing. Through the night air, as he moved from crisis point to crisis point, the warrior skills he had tried to leave behind came flooding back with terrifying efficiency. The way he read an opponent's intentions before they struck, the deadly grace with which he parried and countered, the tactical awareness that let him be wherever the defense was weakest. Yet even as he fought with the skill of a born killer, Ingrid could see the difference in him. Where once he might have pursued fleeing enemies, now he stopped when the immediate threat was neutralized. Where he might have struck killing blows, he often settled for wounds that disabled rather than destroyed. He was still a warrior, but he was no longer a killer for the joy of killing. The first wave of attacks was repulsed, but at a cost. 3 villagers lay dead, and twice as many bore wounds that would mark them for life. The iron wolves had pulled back to regroup, but their losses had been lighter, only 1 dead, a handful wounded. The mathematics of the siege were brutally simple. The defenders were brave and determined, but they were outnumbered and outskilled. Time favored the attackers. "They're testing us," Halvar said as the villagers used the brief respite to tend wounds and redistribute weapons. "The next assault will be harder, more focused. They know our weaknesses now." Ingrid worked to bandage a deep cut on Astrid's arm, trying not to think about how much blood they were losing, how many of their neighbors might not see dawn. The sacred fire bowl continued to burn in the great hall, but it seemed smaller now, more fragile, like hope itself under siege. The second assault came with the fury of a winter storm, all pretense of testing abandoned for the brutal efficiency of warriors who had decided to end the siege quickly. Thorak Bloodaxe led the charge himself, his massive frame cutting through the darkness like death incarnate, his famous axe splitting the air with whispers of destruction. This time, the iron wolves concentrated their attack on the main gate. bringing crude battering rams fashioned from driftwood and iron to bear against the oak timbers. The sound of wood splintering under repeated blows echoed across the village, like the heartbeat of doom, each impact bringing the enemy closer to breakthrough. Ingrid crouched behind the great hall, her healing herbs pouch clutched in trembling hands as she watched the defense crumble. The villagers fought with desperate courage, but they were farmers and fishermen facing professional killers. One by one, the defenders fell, not all dead, but wounded beyond the ability to continue fighting. "The gate won't hold much longer," Magnus shouted over the din of battle, blood streaming from a cut above his eye. "If they break through, they won't." Halvar's voice carried absolute certainty as he strode toward the weakening barrier. "Not while I draw breath." But even as he spoke, the gate exploded inward under a final, devastating blow from the battering ram. Iron wolves poured through the breach, like water through a shattered dam, their war cries echoing off the cottage walls as they spread into the heart of Eldrun. In the chaos that followed, Ingrid found herself face to face with the brutal reality of warfare. Bodies fell around her, some familiar faces from her childhood, others strangers wearing the wolf's head sigil. The careful boundaries between defender and attacker, right and wrong, dissolved in the red madness of close combat. It was then that she saw him, the warrior advancing on the great hall where the children and elderly had taken shelter. His sword was already bloody, his eyes wild with battle lust, and she realized with crystalline clarity that he was heading for the sacred fire bowl, not to steal it or claim it as trophy, but to extinguish it, to snuff out the symbolic heart of their community along with its people. Without conscious thought, Ingrid stepped into his path. She had no weapon save a small knife meant for cutting herbs, no armor but the wool dress she had worn to tend the wounded. But she stood between the raider and the great hall door, her arms spread wide in unconscious mimicry of the woman whose children Halvar had once refused to harm. "You'll have to kill me first," she said, her voice steady despite the terror that made her knees shake. The iron wolf raised his sword, grinning at what he saw as easy prey. But before the blade could fall, another sword intercepted it, longer, older, singing with the authority of generations of warriors who had wielded it in defense of the innocent. Halvar stood behind her now, his ancestral blade locked against his enemy's weapon, his face set in lines of absolute determination. "She's right," he said quietly. "You'll have to kill us both." What followed was not the elegant dance of skilled duelists, but the brutal, desperate struggle of a man fighting for everything he had come to love. The Iron Wolf was skilled, experienced, confident in his abilities. But Halvar fought with something his opponent lacked: purpose beyond mere victory, reasons beyond simple survival. The duel spilled across the village square, witnessed by friend and foe alike. Other combat seemed to pause as warriors on both sides recognized the symbolic importance of this confrontation. Here was the exile facing his former brothers, the protector standing against the destroyer, the future battling the past for the right to exist. When Halvar's blade finally found its mark, sliding between ribs to pierce his opponent's heart, the Iron Wolf fell with something like surprise in his eyes, as if he couldn't quite believe that someone who had once stood among them could now stand so firmly against them. But the victory came at a cost. More iron wolves pressed through the broken gate, and Thorak Bloodaxe himself was fighting his way toward the center of the village, his famous axe cutting down anyone who stood in his path. "The fire," Ingrid gasped, pointing toward the great hall. "We have to protect the fire." She ran toward the building where the sacred bowl burned, Halvar close behind her. But they were not alone. Thorak had seen the same target, recognized its importance to the defenders' morale. The clan leader changed direction, abandoning his pursuit of fleeing villagers to chase this more significant prize. They reached the great hall almost simultaneously, Ingrid and Halvar from one direction, Thorak Bloodaxe from another. The sacred fire bowl sat in the center of the room, its flames dancing as if alive, casting shadows that seemed to move with purpose. "So," Thorax said, breathing heavily but still formidable despite the battle's toll, "the Oathbreaker and his whore think to deny me my victory. Do you know what your betrayal has cost, Halvar? Do you know how many of our brothers have paid for your weakness?" "I know what my silence cost," Halvar replied, raising his sword. "I won't make that mistake again." The final confrontation was about to begin, not just between two warriors, but between two visions of what strength could mean. The truth came not with the clash of steel on steel, but with words that fell like hammer blows in the flickering light of the sacred fire. "You want to know about Eric Grimson?" Thorak Bloodaxe sneered, his massive axe weaving patterns in the air as he faced Halvar across the great hall. "Your precious woman's husband. He died screaming, begging for mercy that never came. I split his skull myself, while your coward of a lover watched from the tree line." "No," Halvar said quietly, his sword steady despite the tremor in his voice. "That's not how it happened, isn't it?" Thorak's grin was cruel as winter wind. "Tell her, Oathbreaker. Tell her how you hid behind the trees while I carved up her man like a feast day goose." But it was Ingrid who spoke, her voice carrying across the hall with unexpected strength. "He's lying." She stepped forward, placing herself between the two warriors. Her healing knowledge suddenly transformed into something far more valuable: understanding. "I've seen how you fight, Halvar. I've watched you train with the village men. You could never hide from a battle, even if you wanted to." Thorax expression shifted, the cruel confidence wavering for just a moment. "The woman knows nothing of warfare. The woman knows men." Ingrid interrupted, her eyes fixed on Halvar's face. "Tell me what really happened on that road. Tell me the truth you've been carrying all these years." Halvar's sword point dropped toward the floor as memory took him back to that blood-soaked morning 10 years past. "Your husband wasn't just defending the caravan," he said slowly. "He was trying to get the children to safety. 3 little ones, traveling with their grandmother to visit family in the south." "Children?" The word escaped Ingrid's lips like a prayer. Eric saw them hiding behind an overturned cart, terrified and crying. He could have escaped, should have escaped, but he went back for them. Halvar's voice cracked with the weight of witnessed heroism. "I was supposed to be part of the killing, but when I saw what he was doing—" "You tried to stop it," Ingrid whispered, understanding flooding through her like dawn breaking over the fjord. "I challenged Thorak's order to slaughter the innocents. When he refused to listen, Halvar's gaze found hers across the firelit space. "I fought against my own clan brothers to protect those children. Your Eric and I, we stood back to back. In those final moments, holding off the others while the grandmother led the little ones to safety." Thorak's roar of rage shattered the moment of revelation. "Lies, pretty lies to win a dead man's woman. You were as much a killer as any of us." "Yes," Halvar agreed simply. "I was. Until that day. Until I saw what real courage looked like, what a man could become when he chose protection over power." The clan leader's axe came down like falling thunder. But Halvar was no longer the conflicted warrior he had been. He was the protector he had chosen to become, fighting not for glory or gold, but for the sacred fire that represented everything worth defending in the world. Community, hope, the possibility of being better than what you were born to be. The battle between them was brief but decisive. When Thorak fell, his famous axe clattering across the stone floor, the remaining iron wolves seemed to lose their purpose. Leaderless, facing a village that had proven willing to die for its principles, they began to retreat toward their ships. As dawn broke over Eldrun, painting the smoke-stained sky in shades of gold and rose, the survivors gathered to count their losses and tend their wounds. 7 villagers had died in the night, including old Magnus, who had taken a spear thrust while defending the harbor. But the community endured. The sacred fire still burned, and the children they had fought to protect were safe. Ingrid found Halvar, sitting beside the fire bowl, staring into flames that seemed to dance with new meaning. His ancestral sword lay across his knees, its blade cleaned of blood, but not of memory. "What happens now?" she asked, settling beside him with careful distance between them. "I don't know," he admitted. "The village is safe, but I'm still the man who brought danger to your door, still someone whose past will always carry shadows." She was quiet for a long moment, then reached into the pocket of her dress and withdrew something small and precious, a simple wooden ring, carved from driftwood, with the same patient skill that had shaped the bowl he had made for her. "I found this among your things," she said softly. "You made it, didn't you? While you were healing, while you were learning to hope again." He nodded, not trusting his voice. "My husband's ring was silver, passed down through his family for 3 generations. It spoke of tradition, of expectations, of a love that fit into, and patterns others had laid down." She slipped the silver band from her finger, holding it up to catch the firelight. "This one is different, rougher, made by hands that have known both destruction and creation, carved by someone who understands that love isn't inherited, it's chosen every day, despite everything the world throws against it." She placed the wooden ring on her finger, feeling its different weight, its promise of new beginnings rather than old obligations. "Are you certain?" Halvar asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "After everything you know about me, everything I've done and failed to do?" "I'm certain that Eric would have liked you," she said, surprising them both with the certainty in her voice. "I'm certain that a man who would stand back to back with a stranger to protect children is a man worth loving. And I'm certain that some stories are worth finishing, no matter how complicated their beginnings." Outside, the village of Eldrun began the long work of healing and rebuilding. But inside the great hall, beside the sacred fire that had survived the night's darkness, 2 people who had thought themselves too old, too wounded, too burdened by the past for new love, began to weave a different kind of future, one thread at a time. One choice at a time, one day at a time, the silver ring went into a small wooden box, honored but no longer worn. The wooden ring stayed where it belonged, marking not the end of one story, but the beginning of another. A tale of redemption and second chances, of love that chose understanding over judgment, of 2 souls who found in each other not perfection, but the courage to keep becoming the people they wanted to be. And in the years that followed, when the children of Eldren gathered around the sacred fire to hear the old stories, they would learn about the winter when love proved stronger than vengeance, when forgiveness built what hatred would have destroyed, and when a widow and a warrior chose each other not despite their scars, but because of the wisdom those scars had taught them about what truly mattered in the end.